I feel like I should dance onto the stage with that intro. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us today. We're going to talk on what we think is an incredibly important topic of how we make sure, from a media perspective, we're doing our bit to stop the planet burning more than it is already, sadly. So this is me in a different outfit, looking more like a school teacher. So I'm Kelly, I'm CEO of Wavemaker UK, and the more intelligent individual stood to my left is...
Yeah, I'm Dom. I have a less severe haircut than I decided to give myself in my staff picture. I head up our Audience Intelligence and Marketing Science team, which is our data tech analytics consultancy.
Thanks, Dom. Okay, so at Wavemaker, we talk very much about our task being about getting unrivaled work out there for our clients that genuinely moves audiences, moves people, but importantly has a positive impact in the world. I'll break that down a little bit for you all because I think it's important. You know, obviously we want to do unrivaled work for our clients, and that's what they come and speak to all agencies out there about. You know, work that creates creativity and innovation. Everything we do has to impact audiences, impact humans. Can you hear me okay?
It's me.
It's you. It's always you. And therefore, everything we do needs to be rooted in audience understanding, in insight, and make sure that it's measurable and has a clear outcome. And those things are things that, as agency leaders, clients ask us to deliver for them all the time. But most importantly, we believe that when we are doing this job for our clients, that we are having a positive impact out there in the world, and therefore we believe that every plan should be inclusive and, from our perspective today, should be sustainable. So the challenge for everyone in this room is that there's a big old elephant. The most sustainable media plan should be no media plan, right? There would be no production, there would be no content produced, there would be no posters, no print. Like, that would be our most sustainable solution. But for all the businesses that are being represented in this room today and that we represent as an agency, that just isn't a solution, right? That's not how the world works. So the sort of positive provocation that I essentially gave to Dom was, how do we go about making sure that we can drive exceptional growth for our clients, but not have it come at the expense of the planet and the expense of decarbonising much more than our plans would be without more effort from us.
Cool. So we took that brief and decided to solve it, as I tend to solve all problems, through the power of maths, because maths will save the planet eventually. All things are maths. But what we noticed is that the key challenge we were running into is we were sort of thinking about the sustainability question the wrong way round. A lot of the sustainability focus is worried about the input, so how much emissions comes from the impressions, the ads we make, all that sort of stuff. And what we started to twig is actually we need to start thinking about in terms of the outcome that the advertising creates. So we created this approach we call eco-effectiveness. I'll talk you through it now, but effectively it's a fusing of sustainability data with outcome data to look at sustainability and decarbonisation through the lens of the outcomes we need to drive, not just abstract inputs in terms of media investment, things like that. There's two things that power this. The first one is Group M's carbon calculator. So this is a collaboration between the Group M agencies and a few partners as well to quantify the carbon emissions associated with different media. So effectively we can go, an impression in TV creates this much incremental CO2 in the world, do that for all the different channels. So that allows us to see the carbon emissions associated with the plan. And then the second building blocks, the really critical bit, is then to get the outcome side of things, is marketing mix modeling or MMM or econometrics or one of the 4 other names that this type of modeling has, because marketing people are woefully inconsistent at naming things. But essentially this is the gold standard for evaluating the outcomes of media. So it's a piece of statistical analysis, looks at kind of variations in your outcomes over time, builds a model to understand what are the drivers, advertising and non-advertising. So we have the amount of carbon associated with our plan and what that plan did in terms of commercial outcomes. And that allows us to create two views of effectiveness. The first one, hopefully everyone's broadly familiar with, which is ROI, or return on investment. So that is how hard the pounds and pence are working. So for every pound I invest, what I get back in terms of the kind of returns of the business. But then we created a parallel currency, which we refer to as return on carbon, or ROC. So the way to think about that is in the same way that your ROI is effectively going, how hard does the pounds and pence I put in work for me? Return on carbon is the same thought, but applied to CO2. So how hard does each kilogram of carbon dioxide associated with the plan pay back in terms of brand and business outcomes? And those outcomes can range. They can be brand consideration, brand awareness, hard sales outcomes, doesn't really matter, but it's the same core concept. And what you effectively want is these two numbers to be as big as possible. Because if I've got my pounds and pence working really hard and I'm maximizing the impact that my carbon emissions create, that is a more sustainable and a more effective plan. You do all the clever maths and you end up, whenever you do a kind of exciting new data concept, you end up with a fairly dull-looking graph, but here is a graph. It's a bubble chart rather than a bar chart, so there's something. But along the bottom here, this is an all-brand average. I would, because I can see people always take pictures of this one massive caveat coming up around the danger of averages. But along the bottom axis here, you've got return on investment, so the further to the right-hand side, the harder the thing pays back commercially. Up the y-axis, you've then got return on carbon, so you want that number to be as high as possible because that then says you're getting more sales outcomes from your CO2 put in. Size of the bubble then represents size of the effect. So you're kind of balancing three different views. And what we can start to see is that the channels break down into kind of four groups. Top right-hand corner, above average ROI, above average ROC, sort of do best of both. These are sustainable media channels that also generate their effects very cost effectively and kind of carbon effectively. Bottom right-hand corner is where you have what we would class something as an environmental compromise. So this is where the channel pays back very well commercially, but there is a trade-off in terms of its kind of carbon emissions. So it's a higher carbon emitting channel relative to its sales effect. Top left is in the reverse of that. These channels overperform their kind of peer set on a carbon basis, but underperform on an ROI. And thankfully in this example, because everyone hates to be in the bottom left, but the bottom left would be a channel that is sort of underperforming in both regards. That doesn't mean you don't do that channel, but then you assess the volume contribution. So TV, as an example, tends to find itself somewhere in the bottom left-hand corner because you don't tend to use TV as an efficiency channel, you tend to use it for volume purposes. So if you have a high volume channel in that bottom left-hand corner, it doesn't mean you don't do it, it just means you have to balance it out with the channels elsewhere. So we get this sort of view, and then what we were hoping to do is kind of go, and here are the general rules of thumb. You always do, VOD is always incredible, don't do print and things, and then await the barrage of constructive feedback from various different media owners as to why we're wrong. But then we started looking at this for different brands, right? So this is a finance brand, this is what it looks like for an entertainment brand, this is what it looked like for a retail brand. And very quickly we were starting to find that brand to brand, these bubbles are moving around rapidly, right? You look at let's take out of home, right? On this finance brand, it's sitting in the best of both worlds category. In this example, it's there but smaller, and then in this other example, it's moving around. So the channels don't always consistently end up in the same place because actually there's a huge amount of things that can cause variation. So ROI payback varies a huge amount brand to brand. There's a brilliant Thinkbox study. Partly I say it's brilliant because I was involved in it, but I'm horrifically biased. But also there's a kind of big meta-analysis looking at the variability of channel payback. So channels like social have very kind of big spectrums of payback, and therefore that will affect how it looks on an ROI and an ROC basis, because for some brands, social performs incredibly, for some brands, it's not so great. And what we were quickly finding essentially was there are no real rules of thumb. You don't get to a world where you're like print always bad, radio always good. Depending on the brand, depending on the sector, but also then starting to depend on the partners you were using. Because if my outdoor supplier is using a coal power station to turn on the lights in the light box and printing it all on the finest unrecycled paper, that will change the ROC calculation from exactly the same type of outdoor site, but through a supplier who uses more sustainable energy generation for the power of the panels and recycled paper. So we were quite quickly finding this varies a hell of a lot. So instead of looking at abstract rules, what we needed to do is get this into a currency where we could optimize it and make sense of it on a kind of individual brand by brand basis. And that involves balancing kind of three sets of diminishing returns curves. So hopefully people are broadly familiar with diminishing returns curves, but this is just your typical one that most of you have probably seen before, relationship between spend on the x-axis and sales on the y-axis. And the sales in this case could be any outcome. They all have roughly the same shape. The curve will get flatter and flatter and flatter the more you try and spend, because it gets incrementally harder and harder to drive more sales. And that's just because you're driving excessive frequency or you're running out of people to talk to, that sort of thing. So every incremental pound we invest pays back slightly harder, but we can basically work out for any point of spend on that curve how many sales I'd expect to get. What we then need to look at is what we refer to as the marginal ROI. So this is the ROI associated with the last pound that we have spent. So typically when ROI gets reported, it's a total ROI, which would be total spend divided by total sales. No, that's wrong. Total sales divided by total spend. I only do that all day, every day. I feel I should know that by now. Marginal ROI is then the concept of the last pound's payback. So each incremental pound I'm spending, what is the payback of the millionth pound I spent compared to the 999,000? So this tells me if as I increase the spend, how those increases in spend are paying back one by one. So as I move up and down, I can then see, am I better off putting incremental spend into TV, radio, print, all that sort of stuff. We then now have a third curve, which is marginal ROC. So this is the marginal return of every kilogram of CO2 we are adding to the plan. So as we increase the spend and we increase the associated emissions, because if you do more media, you have more emissions, how much incrementally does that pay back? So every kilogram I'm adding, I can now see in this example, which I think this is a TV curve just as an example, that the payback, the incremental business benefit I do from increasing the emissions associated with the plan decreases and decreases and decreases. In exactly the same way marginal ROI does, right? It gets harder and harder to generate sales, therefore each kilogram works less hard for us. And what you can start to do is obviously you would have these three sets of curves for all of the different touch points and all your different media channels. You can overlay phasing and loads of other clever stuff. And you can start to work through, is there a more sustainable media plan that is also going to generate me the same ROI? And what we quickly found is actually, and being transparent, we weren't expecting this as an outcome, is that consistently we can reduce the emissions associated with our clients' media plans without any impact on ROI. And actually, in a lot of cases, you can improve the ROI along with it. Just by understanding where you are on all those curves that come from your MMM, fused with the carbon calculator data, we can see that, you know, for an automotive brand, it was 20%, for a retailer, it was 43%, for another brand, it was 13%. The order of magnitude of the improvements sort of depends on how well optimized the plan was and also the channel selection that happened to be in place. So there are some channels where it's easier to make bigger gains if they're particularly overinvested. But essentially, this is, you know, we do some good old-fashioned media optimization, we find the right ways of spending in the right channels, and we can consistently reduce the kind of impact of our plans with no detrimental impact. So when we're selling this into a client, where's the downside? The plan is as good as the one I had before, but I've reduced the emissions associated by 20, 30%.
Thank you, Dom. You've done all the complicated bits for me.
I've done all the graphs.
So I think what's really important in kind of today's world is that we are just being much more responsible with the way we are spending our clients' money. It's not necessarily right in every marketing plan to have purpose as something that you are openly talking about in your comms and in your creative, because it doesn't work to drive the business and it doesn't feel right with consumers. But what is right on every single plan is the fact that we can reduce the carbon output and the carbon footprint of the media that we put out into the world. And so, you know, what Dom has shown you is that we don't think there needs to be a compromise. You can continue to drive significant improvement in things like ROI, but also reduce the impact that you're having on our planet. I think the important thing is that we need to work together, not only as a client agency group, but as an industry, to really make sure that we are driving effective decarbonisation. And then the other thing that you should all very much take away is that there isn't kind of one rule of thumb. You know, all of those bubble charts are very different by category, by brand. The most important thing is that you are talking to your agencies about it. And if your agencies can't do that, we can talk to you about what we could do to help. But you need to start to measure, you need to start to quantify how much impact you're having from a carbon effectiveness point of view, so that you can start to reduce that, but not have a negative impact on the business that you're trying to deliver on, which we all know, you know, is becoming harder and harder. So that's that. I think we're in time, and we're taking questions. If you want to take some, we can take a couple of questions if you want, if you think we've got time. I mean, Don will answer them, but we can take the questions.
Okay, thank you so very much for that presentation. It was really brilliant. Great to know. Have we got time for questions?
Yeah.
Great. Should we take some questions?
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, you have to now.
I was going to say, I don't have much choice.
Okay, so if you've got some questions, I can see some hands up there at the back. Oh, we've got one here. Please say your name if that's okay, unless you want to be anonymous.
Hi, I'm Ricky Myers. I noticed that podcasting or podcast advertising was missing, or maybe it's within one of the categories, but wouldn't that be even more carbon effective than radio? Or
Yeah, I mean, all audio tends to be more carbon effective. To be honest, the reason it wouldn't be in the charts is not a conscious decision to omit it. It is just it's the benchmark data that we had to build the chart. So on specific client examples where they're investing, so one of our government clients invests heavily in podcasts and digital audio, it's quantified in their return on carbon. It's just not one of the examples. But yeah, a key thing though is, and one of the big things that affects where things end up is the digital components of things, because in general, in audio, but as well also in some of the video channels, particularly in out of home, the more digital the format is, it tends to be more sustainable than its linear counterpart. Doesn't always mean that it's a bad thing to do, but yeah, podcasting is definitely in all the calculations, it's just not in those examples.
Another question there at the back. Thank you.
Hi, Chris Daniels from Haymarket. So you've covered off what people should potentially buy, but do you look at how you then buy it? So I'm thinking specifically for display, digital display, open marketplace versus PMP versus direct.
Yeah.
We haven't built that in really.
Yeah, it's not built in perfectly yet, partly because the Group M carbon calculator, which is the source data, is constantly evolving. Certainly one of the key areas in that is to increase the granularity, because I think there is a general assumption in there around programmatic versus open marketplace, but it's a fairly broad assumption. But frankly, part of the reason for doing presentations like this is to stimulate demand for providing the data that allows us to then differentiate between different, not just different types of buy, but even down to different types of ad tech platform within the buy, because just because it's programmatic doesn't mean it's always bad, depending on how the technology infrastructure works and stuff like that. But granularity is definitely the next step of this, so that we can go down to a partner level.
Great. One more question here at the front. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sal. So you've talked a lot about this, and I can understand it from large media budgets perspective and how you could fit it into sort of your econometrics plans or whatever. How does it work for smaller brands and smaller budgets? Like, are they still able to get that level of depth of knowledge, really?
Yeah, I mean, a misconception on MMM is it requires huge amounts of media budget to do it. I think that is probably a legacy issue that you can, we have a client who does sub £500,000 worth of spend a year and still has MMM in place, as long as you can get robust data. I think the other thing we are starting to do with this, as we start to broaden it and roll it out, is the logic isn't restricted to MMM, it's just MMM is the best way of proving incrementality, but you could in principle use the logic on attribution models in digital platforms to get your sales outcome number and still apply the same logic. The other thing is also just learning from benchmarks, right? We have built a Wavemaker, a version of this, which is built on our benchmark database, so that if a client doesn't have MMM, we can still get directionally the right learnings, leveraging other brands in their category and other brands at similar scales.
Great. One more question here at the front.
Hi, I'm Sumia. Is creative production the carbon emissions from producing the creative included in your analysis?
No.
Not as a default, only because our role is to, our link in the chain, if you like, is to decarbonise the media plan. There are individual cases where we build that in, though. So on a client-by-client basis, we can do it, because as part of a wider WPP stuff, there's quantification on carbon emissions associated with creative and production. The other thing we're toying with where it makes sense is the emissions associated with the product that's sold,
yes.
Particularly where the product or the sales action is a decarbonising action of its own. So like a train company trying to get people to switch from road to rail would decarbonise as a sales outcome. So we are building those in. We don't build them as a general rule because sometimes they just don't make a lot of sense. But yeah, on an individual basis, we can totally build that in.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you so much, Giles.
Thank you.